everyone, welcome. Thank you so kindly for joining us. My name is Cara Johnson. I'm the event coordinator for Green Apple Books here in San Francisco. And tonight I am very glad to welcome Gabrielle Bendiner-Viani for the release of her book, The Cities We Made, The Essential Stories of Everyday Places. Let's give a hand for Gabrielle. So she is joined tonight by Susan Schwarzenberg. Let's give a hand for Susan as well. Tonight. Thank you all for joining us, both here in person and also online. Hello, online audience. I'm waving to a camera over here in case you can't see. We appreciate you. We are broadcasting from San Francisco, California. We open each of our events with a land acknowledgement. We are operating on unceded Ramaytush-Ohlone land, and we think that acknowledgement requires action, and so we encourage you to donate either your time or monetary means to an Indigenous organization each time you hear a land acknowledgement. Green Apple has information about the Ramaytush-Ohlone Land Trust at the back desk here if you are interested in how to participate in this project of remutuation. And while we open each of our events with a land acknowledgement, I think it is particularly pertinent considering not only the recent land back wins in the East Bay Shell Mound, but also because tonight we are celebrating a book about place and the liberatory capabilities of place. So I think it's particularly pertinent this evening. I have very brief business before I let these two take over. Now is a good time to silence your cell phones if you have not already. I've been told that picture taking is okay though, so welcome to do that, but just don't take a call in the middle of the event. Please do check out our full event calendar online at greenapplebooks.com. We have a really great season ahead of us, including the event you are currently attending. The restroom is behind me. It is available after the event, not during the event for obvious reasons. If you need to know how to get there, do ask me and I will gladly help you. We have copies of The Cities We Made at the front register. You can find them there. If you've been here before, you've certainly heard me say that when you buy books from us, not only do you support us as an independent bookstore, you support the authors who put so much work into making these books, and then you get to have a book, which might be the best part. So if you're able, we always appreciate it. Thank you so kindly. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the two folks who are joining us this evening. First, Susan Schwarzenberg is an educator, visual artist, and curator. She initiated and directs the Fisher Bay Observatory and holds a senior artist position at the Exploratorium. And in this capacity, she leads the Climate and Landscape Initiative, a multi-year program to advance the environmental arts and sciences with a specific focus on community resilience and sea level rise for youth and adults. Schwarzenberg has previously taught at San Francisco Art Institute, California College of the Arts, and Stanford University. Let's give one more hand for Susan Schwarzenberg. And last but most certainly not least, Dr. Gabrielle Bendiner-Viani is a visual urbanist and co-founder of the interdisciplinary studio Viscata. She is the author of Contested City, which is a finalist and honoree for the Brendan Gill Award. A widely exhibited photographer, she was a professor of urban studies at the New School for a decade and a fellow at the International Center of Photography, the Center for Urban Community Research at Goldsmiths, University of London. She holds a doctorate in environmental psychology from the Graduate Center of CUNY, and her book, The Cities We Made, is the reason we're here tonight. Let's give one more hand for Dr. Gabrielle Bendiner-Viani.
Thank you, Car. Thank you all for
stay there until you're done.
Okay. Thank you all for being here. It's really wonderful to see all of you and really wonderful to have you and here and really wonderful to be doing this talk in San Francisco. And thank you so much to Green Apple and to Car for hosting us and being so thoughtful and generous in all the ways that you've been setting up this event. So thank you so much. So I'm going to start off, I'm going to start off by reading some from the book, and then Susan and I will be in conversation, just like we have been in conversation for a lot of years. So maybe this will be a kind of dropping in on conversations that have maybe started before and can continue today. So as Car said, I'm Gabrielle Bendiner-Viani. I'm a photographer and a writer and an urbanist and environmental psychologist, which nobody knows what that means, and that's fine. But basically, it's somebody who spends time thinking about people's relationship to place and using social science ways and modes of thinking about how do we understand how people relate to place and why does it matter. Keep going in and out. So two of the things that I really value in my work and kind of as a framing for this work and this book are really valuing people's lived experience and their own expertise in their lived experience. And then secondly, art making as a kind of way of knowing. Those are two things that I grapple with a lot and think a lot about why this matters and how that really shapes the way we understand our places and how we can know about them. Does this kind of keep going in and out?
It does. You are not wrong.
No. That's also fine. That's fine too. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Fine. Okay, good. Anyway, I began this work about 20 years ago, really asking my neighbors, both in Brooklyn and in Oakland, for their tours of their neighborhoods. And as it's been more than 20 years, this work has also been a huge part of shaping my life. So it's a very kind of emotional part of this book too. It's been part of how I really have learned to be a person in the world is also through a lot of these tours. So I'm going to read a little bit here, and then we'll get started. So way back in 2001, when I asked Mike in Prospect Heights in Brooklyn how he had prepared to take me on a tour of his neighborhood that I had requested, he explained, I said to myself, we'll take a walk around the block and I'll tell you what I know, So much of the work of being human happens in everyday places. We become ourselves, we become able to see each other, to be a community. Everyday places are personal, but also global, intertwining history, emotion, memory, their experience, talked about, negotiated, and woven into our lives. We create places, and in turn, places create us. It's not too much to say that these small public and semi-private spaces even have the potential to be spaces of liberation. It's in these spaces that we find the cities that we need. So, what are these remarkable everyday spaces? They're often thought of as banal: sidewalks, diners, bus stops, churches, meeting places, barber shops, bike shops, repair shops, donut shops, laundromats, schools, parks, playgrounds, libraries. The work that these places do helps us become ourselves and to become communities, laying the groundwork for a functional society. And I call that work place work. So early on in my work in Oakland and in Brooklyn, someone challenged what might be the purpose of knowing about everydayness, asking, to what use could this project be put? And thinking of the then recent losses in New Orleans in the wake of 2005's Hurricane Katrina, I answered that if you understood everyday life and you understood how a place functioned, how it worked, then if some sort of natural disaster occurred, you would know how to rebuild. You would know what was missing in the wake of that disaster. In the subsequent years, I mulled over this question of use or purpose, sometimes really taking it on board and sometimes sort of rejecting it to say, well, part of what the purpose of this work is the understanding what's happening in the world. So when I returned to Prospect Heights in 2014 and was inspired to create the Intersection Prospect Heights Public Art and Dialogue project from these guided tours that people had started to take me on in 2001, it was because I realized that a natural disaster hadn't happened, but a man-made one had. I saw the damage wrought by the gentrification accelerated by a very large-scale development, stadium development and housing development at the edge of the neighborhood. New expensive infill development and higher residential and commercial rents had arrived with people who could pay, and in preparation for even wealthier people that landlords imagined would come once the buildings were built. Spoiler alert, none of those buildings are finished. 20%. So many of the small businesses my tour guides had taken me to were vulnerable and priced out as their rents were raised. Sometimes those storefronts were then kept empty, waiting for luxury businesses who would pay top dollar. Many things that were special to people about the neighborhood were at risk. So in 2020, I realized that the next in these waves of crises, these natural and man-made disasters, was the pandemic that held us 6 feet apart for over a year. Recovering from this crisis would necessitate remembering and supporting the places in which the crucial and easily overlooked everyday interactions that help us be together happen. So to do so, it's necessary to be able to name what they do and also to value what they do, in that sense of being place work. So the everyday, though, is very tricky to write about because it can feel both incredibly boring and also unbearably illuminating. So while it can seem like nothing really happens, in fact, everyday places and their people change all the time. As geographer Alan Cred has eloquently written, they're ever becoming. So place work is a way to understand how we and our places are always in flux. Place work is the dynamic and reciprocal work that everyday places do for and with individuals and communities, enabling us to grow into being ourselves and enabling us to be together. By doing these two things, helping us to become ourselves, helping us to become communities, these places do nothing short of creating the conditions for a functional society. So without places that do this kind of work, our lives are at best hollow and two-dimensional, and at worst, they're filled with violence. So this is a book about the work that places do to support our becoming ourselves, our becoming able to be together. So becoming themselves was what David told me about at the supermarket, Tanya at the diner, Cynthia in front of her house, and Marty on neighborhood streets. It's intensely personal work that happens in public. Places can help our bodies feel free and also shape the way that we feel that we belong. So becoming community, being together, like maybe just being together with strangers, was what I heard from Tuolde in the donut shop, from Neville in the electronics store, from Julia at the fence. I could see how their places fostered two crucial kinds of talk, the casual but humanity-acknowledging quality of everyday banter, and then also the enduring talk that grows over time, over weeks, over years, builds on trust, and might eventually change everything. And in this book, my tour guides in Brooklyn and Oakland take us on walks through places that do each of these kinds of work. They notice what's usually taken for granted, talking about the place work in their two somewhat unremarkable, though very beloved, neighborhoods. But of course it happens in many cities and towns, probably some you know very well. So these places also help us to figure out how we relate to worlds far, far beyond our everyday. So, oh, I see, Cynthia and Mosswood exclaimed as we talked about why I was asking her for a tour of her neighborhood. And echoing what sociologist Dorian Massey called the global sense of the local, Cynthia proceeded to find a much more eloquent way than either me or Massey to describe this project. And she said, it's how people fit the big world into their small worlds. I just want to read 2 excerpts from the book, from people's stories, to give you a sense of how these places really come to have meaning and stories about them. All right, Susan, can I ask you to read one and I'll read the other? Will you read one and I'll read the other?
Okay.
Okay, I'll read the first one. So some of these really come from, these are the work in Prospect Heights where I turned these stories into guided tours where people walked through their neighborhoods and we read the stories out loud. And so reading people's stories out loud is an important part of the work, and thinking about how we can kind of bring voices and stories back to places and help us also reflect on the places that we care about. How does that help us tell our own stories? So I'm going to read Marty's story from Oakland. one of many of Marty's stories. There were people here. This is Telegraph Avenue and 34th Street. This neighborhood was pretty solidly black. Lois and I grew up 2 blocks further down. But we were up here all the time. We used to hit the plum trees up there. The hospitals were there, but they were much smaller. If you look at this neighborhood, it was a lot more prosperous commercially because there were houses in here under the freeway. There were people here. I would babysit for all the kids here, just as they would babysit for me. Lois has her dad's complexion and looks, and her dad was a red cap. You know, the red caps were the porters. I can never forget, Jack would be coming home from work with the uniform on, and I'd say, I always wanted to be like him. And he'd say, no, boy, you don't want to do this kind of work. This is the kind of work your great uncle did. My great uncle Frank was a Pullman porter, too, and he worked out of Chicago and LA for the Southern Pacific. Uncle Frank got a master's degree from the University of Chicago in 1921. Where the hell was he going to work? No one was going to hire him. But this was why you had this degree of progressivism among these Pullman porters, because so many of them were so much better educated than the people who were actually on the train. What we saw in this block was not the kind of blight that you see now, the people going to work every day, black men going to work every day. And here Tanya's story from Caesar.
Okay. Let me get myself situated here. This is George and Vanderbilt Avenue. It doesn't have to be a big thing that you do. I really like this place. Besides the fact that you see different people, you just hear people talking, joshing around. It's very mixed crowd in here, race, sex, age. You see people from all different backgrounds. You see cops come in here, you see sanitation, you see park, police, plumbers, accountants, politicians, and you hear people talking trash. It's funny. Mike gives the place its life, because he'll talk to anybody and he'll talk crap with anybody. Here in New York, America, you have this whole thing about being somebody and being somebody at a certain level. The doctor, the lawyer, the Wall Street, whatever. And you have people here who have a little life. They run the luncheonette and they make people happy. And they know they make people happy. They know they make people happy. I like that. They like it. They come back. They don't like it. They don't come back. It appeals to me very viscerally. It makes me realize, yeah, you need some money, but you don't need to be chasing a dollar to the exemption of everything else. And it doesn't have to be a big thing that you do. I feel that they love it, and that makes me like it also. If I'm in a bad mood and I come in here, I walk out in a better mood. It's just a place. It's comfortable, you know? Do you know a place like that? Anybody?
Thank you, Susan. So I'm going to read just a tiny little piece just to kind of help you know why this is a book and why now. Partially because this little section is called You Don't Miss Your Water Till Your Well Runs Dry, or Lockdown Blues. And so the casual aspect of everyday places that do important place work is not incidental. This casualness lets people join when they can, as they can, and as they will, knowing that they can always come back, that they can always rejoin. And this became really clear during the pandemic, particularly when we couldn't be in most of our everyday places. Though even then, networks persisted and were created, mutual aid networks, connections by Zoom, certainly the outrage, release, and power of daily Black Lives Matter protests. But very often these connections needed to be formalized, organized, though not always, in a way that everyday connections do not. And in formalizing them, you lose something, some of their inclusiveness. If you were texting with people during lockdown, trying to support people, It meant that you had their phone numbers. It meant that you knew how to reach them. But by contrast, in most public interactions, you don't have people's phone numbers. You might not even know their names. But you do know that they'll be in a public space at the same time every day or every week, and that gives them and you stability. And in those interactions, do we ever say anything important? Very, very rarely. But we validate the fact that we're all human. Time passes, that we all feel things, that we feel pain, that we feel happiness, that we're experiencing the world together, not individually. The banter, the exchange, the talking trash, the ways in which people build, public spaces build people's capacity to share even small amounts of their lives with people they genuinely don't know. Lacking all of that makes your life less good. So many, many things threaten our hardworking places through demolitions of the places themselves and displacement of the people who make them what they are, who facilitate their important work. For example, in the pandemic and before and now after, small businesses in the Bay Area and in New York City and much beyond are and have been at risk. They suffer from very little rental protection and from rising costs due to supply chain crises and small profit margins, making them some of the most vulnerable parts of our cities. Small businesses as a category are often discussed as economic drivers, but they're very rarely addressed as unique and crucial places that have the potential to shelter people's lives. They're rarely recognized as doing this vital kind of work. Systemic racism, neighborhood displacement, COVID-19, climate change all intersect and hit people hardest who are already at the edge. And all of these threats increase our need for hard-working local places, the kinds of places that support dialogue and make space for negotiation, support the interactions that build community, that create more than financial capital. These places are one part of dismantling white supremacy. Yet the threats that make hardworking places so necessary are the very things that endanger those places. These valuable places sustain us and are where we build the networks that help us get along. Place work is all the more vital now because in this late pandemic moment, in climate crisis, in racially segregated neighborhoods, in a corporate and distracted culture, we need all the support possible to honestly become ourselves and to become that very messy thing that is community. And I want to close the reading with just one of my favorite pieces from the book. And this was right as I was sort of finishing a lot of this work, and I asked my neighbor, Amanjat, who was 12 at the time, after where she would take me on a tour of the neighborhood. She did. And she said, well, you know, when you stand out and you can see where the freeways are and you can see the sun setting, that part right there. Thank you. Now we're going to talk.
Now we're going to talk. Yeah, I mean, Gabrielle and I met each other at a visual sociology conference at the San Francisco Art Institute in, I don't remember when. But the thing I love about her work and the questions she asks, you know, were kind of central to me too. I have an arts background, and she comes out of the, you know, environmental psychology, which I wish I had known about in those days. But I felt like the kind of work I wanted to do and the kind of work she did didn't fit into any particular mold that I could think of. It wasn't exactly art. It wasn't exactly science. It was really kind of getting into the fabric of life. You know, understanding what people are thinking and how they relate to each other. It's not really, sometimes I've also had, you know, I've crossed in the art world and the design world and the education world, and this isn't about the built environment. You know, it's not really, nobody made a master plan for the places that you've studied, and I just wanted you to talk a little bit about how did you I mean, most of us, when we go out and photograph, we photograph buildings or people, but then how did you get beyond that? How did you get beyond that to start asking for these tours and trying to really get, like, what are these people thinking?
What are they thinking? Well, I think that's part of it was that I think in some ways that, so I've been asking people for their tours of their neighborhoods and their houses for a really long time, much beyond before this work. And part of it really started because I wanted to I was photographing in neighborhoods and I wanted to make pictures of these places, sometimes where I lived and sometimes where I didn't. And I sort of felt like I was always a little bit hitting a wall where I wanted to know, I knew kind of what I thought or how I felt about these places or what they seemed to mean to me, but I was curious about what they meant to other people. And so I started to think about this idea of just asking people to, take me around their neighborhood. And I was very, I actually started doing this with friends first, and one of the first ones was a friend who grew up in a very, very small town in Pennsylvania, and I grew up in New York City, and I was like, this is shocking. I have never been anywhere like this. How do you even navigate this place? I was like a stranger in a strange land. And so, from trying that kind of work out, I started to think, there's these stories that people tell when they're physically moving through a place are really different than the stories somebody might tell you if you just asked, tell me about your neighborhood, tell me where you're from. That when you're physically with somebody, walking through a place, driving with them, that embodied thing of telling stories really transforms the way that they tell you about place. And also started to transform the way I started to see the world. And that was very, very exciting. And then I thought, well, what this gives me and what it gave me as a photographer felt like, well, there's something different for me to respond to. I'm responding to the place. I'm responding to my own experiences of it, but I also hear these stories in my head when I'm making these photographs. And it felt like a much richer kind of way of being in the world and trying to make photographs about the world. And I think, it's funny, that whole question about, like, being, is it research, is it art, what is it? And I think that a lot of, some people who use photographs as part of research tend to see them as data and like truth, which is like the exact opposite of what anyone who makes photographs and thinks about art and art history thinks about what images are. And I always found that really strange. So part of what I was always really quite interested in was like, well, how can you not think that photographs are truth, but how can they be interesting anyway? Mm-hmm. And how can they tell us really important things without us feeling like they're fact, right? How can images tell us something else that's important? Yeah. And I've been arguing with people about this for a long time. So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we both gravitated towards visual sociology, hoping that was a field that would help us do the work we were doing. But yeah, the way photography was used was very much a kind of a ground truthing or something. Asking people to describe pictures, and that's also important, I think. I mean, there's valuable tools in that world, I think, but getting a little bit more deeper into your work, I feel like it's more about psychology or something. It's more, there's a psychology of place, and I feel like I've searched for it a little bit in my own work. Like, how do you build that image of how people have made the places that they feel comfortable in or that they have longing for? I think there's a number of stories in your project. I think especially in Oakland, one that resonated with me. There's a guy you walk around with, and he talks about this playground where he did athletics, and he kind of found himself. He felt free. He really but he's taking you there a few years after, and now it's like a kid's playground, and so it doesn't really have, the same thing that he experienced when he was living there. But then you also go talk to a woman who saved that place from drug dealing and stuff 30 years before that. So it's not so much about the place, but it's all these kind of experiences that people build around it.
I think one of the things that was important to me in thinking about this book, and maybe part of kind of a breakthrough in the way that I started to think about the stories and all of this research that I've been doing for so long, was that I could see that people were both, doing this work of building community, but I could also see that a huge part of what they were doing was telling me about how they built themselves and how they found themselves in these places. That these places were a huge part of their sense of self and their sense of how could a place actually sort of be a part of their own ethics, their own sense of freedom in the world, and that other people and being in public might be part of that, but the transformation was in themselves. And I think that was really, really powerful in terms of thinking about the work that these kinds of places do, that it's not just about us being together and a kind of wonderful kumbaya kind of feeling about that would be ideal, but maybe not always going to happen. But that it was about how in this interaction in public, people started to feel like they could see themselves differently. And I think so that example of the playground with David, it was really interesting to me to know many people talk about that playground. Many people on these walks talked about that playground, all from quite different perspectives. And so he was the only one who had used it as a child, and so his very physical and embodied experience of it was so central to this idea of the place, right? And so I felt like, well, all of these other things. So Robin, the woman who had worked on shaping that playground, so she had helped basically create the playground that he then, many years later, found that sense of self in. And then it went through later iterations in which he then felt like, well, maybe it's not for me anymore as a teenager, it's only for young children. And so I think what was interesting, though, is that there's this tension between the kind of psychology of the place, but also there is the questions about planning of the place too, that there was choices made in which that space, that playground, was very, very inclusive to a wide variety of kids. And then there's a way, and it kind of paralleled a lot of very intensive gentrification of the neighborhood, where it became really only focused on very, very young children, in which case a lot of teenagers really felt were no longer welcome in that space, and then really didn't have any space to be in the neighborhood. And that idea of them all of a sudden not finding any space where you had capacity to be free really changed their sense of belonging to the place. And so I think there's that tension between kind of planning choices and the kind of lived experience. One other woman said, in an earlier iteration of that playground, the one that David had enjoyed, she said, well, our building, our window looked out over, one window in our building looked out on that playground. It was right above the handball court. And she said, the ball just kept going through the window. So eventually we just let it be. And because it was more important to us to let the kids have a place to play and feel free than to fix the window. And that kind of response and that idea of the fact that kind of this wide variety of people really need to feel a sense of freedom and capacity to be welcomed in a place, it doesn't always look neat. It can be the not fixing the window is the thing that allows a sense of freedom. And I always thought that all of those people's story about that playground were so beautiful in the way that they intermeshed. All of them told those stories without being prompted about the playground, that it had been so kind of central to so many different people. So
yeah. I mean, our city is also maybe just about longing for what they were or what they could be. I mean, I felt like a lot of the descriptions almost felt like there was like a transience in place and time and people's experiences. And in some of your photographs, they feel there's a kind of a loneliness or something, you know. And I feel like life is this transitory thing that how do you capture that in a photo series or a way to think about how to capture the important parts of cities, because you can't put it on a billboard, you can't build it into a playground really. It's really capturing those stories, I think. And can you talk a little bit about that sense of longing that people have, and they live in a place for a long time and they see the changes and it's kind of all in their head?
Yeah, well, I think people kind of constantly have that sense of past time as well as present time, like that those things, you know, kind of layer on top of each other, and that's fine. I mean, time does pass. that's normal, and things do change. And so I think there is kind of always, like, we live in a moment of constant both kind of past experience and possible futures, right? All mixed into the same moment that we're always living. And I think a lot of these places hold that for us, right? They kind of remind us of those things, which I think is important. I mean, I think there's also, you know, there's kind of been a lot of work written about, like, well, if you know what the name was before the thing on it, that's actually on the sign, does that make you more of a, you know, do you belong more to that place? Like, do you know that place, or does it belong more to you? But I think that there was also, what's funny, I think, in some of this work was that a lot of these people were, you know, I wasn't asking them to reflect on the neighborhood, you know, how was it 10 years ago, or whatever it was. I was like asking people, like, you know, right now, give me a tour of your neighborhood right now. And even though now those tours were quite a long time ago, still people told me kind of stories over time. Like, they told me stories about things that were happening right then, but also like kind of all the pieces of their lives that had led up to that moment. And I think those things always seemed like they were kind of layered into all the places that people took me to. And one of the things that was interesting to me was the way that I would always go back to people with the photographs. So they would take me on these walks, and then I would photograph the places people had taken me to. And then I would bring the photographs back to them and ask them what they thought, what they saw. And what was always very interesting to me was the ways in which those stories were very frequently not different, like contradictory, but different in the sort of way that they would tell me things. So sometimes they would sort of pass by something and sort of give it kind of a cursory, like, oh yeah, there's that place. And then when I would show them the photograph of it, they would be able to tell me this completely different, much deeper story, like when we had this sort of time to, like, hold on to it. And it made me think a lot about the ways in which, you know, part of how the everyday is, we just get on with our lives. Like, you don't stop and spend time thinking about how does the supermarket make you feel, right? Even though it can be really emotional. But part of what was important to me was that idea of, like, well, you know, if these multiple times are layered over all of these places, looking at the photographs together, and also realize that this was all prior to, like, the existence of an iPad. So sometimes people have asked, like, oh, did you, like, show them physical copies or, like, have it on a screen or whatever? And I was like, yeah, that was, like, not a thing. So it was all, they were like, but that idea of, you know, that you could kind of hold on to, like, literally hold on to it, but also kind of hold on to time in a different sort of way through looking at the photographs was another way of kind of telling different layers of stories through that process. And I think it contributes to that kind of like excavation of time that comes through some of the stories.
Yeah. I mean, things in the supermarket is a trigger.
Yeah, right. And
These things are kind of triggers for memories or experiences or a sense of connection or comfort. I wondered if you'd talk a little bit more about the notion of freedom that people. I thought that was a big jump in your book in thinking about the notion of freedom by feeling comfortable in a place. And
I think it was one of the things that really in seeing how people's stories started to talk about their sense of self, that one of them was one piece of that was really about how these places, kind of reinforce their sense of how do you act in the world and who are you and what's the right way to be with other people. A lot of times people talked about places doing that kind of work. But at the same time, one of the things that people also talked about was kind of where they just physically felt free. And they didn't always use that word. But a lot of the conversations really were about where they felt like they could sort of almost just do nothing, but be allowed to do nothing. And where they could kind of have that expansiveness of expression of themselves and what that actually felt like. And so that idea of where you could just I could just be myself, or that I could do what I wanted, or these kind of or I can go where I want without kind of having a purpose. All of that seems so central to a lot of people's tours. And that started to feel like, well, actually what they're talking about is this sense of freedom, right? This sense of what does it feel like to be free? What does it feel like to not be constrained by a wide variety of many of the things that constrain us? So what is it that can feel like, and how are there places that do that work of helping us feel free? And how are there places that constrain us, right? So that, and in a world, right, and I think one of the things that I thought a lot about in writing the book was how, most of these places and most of the places in America are not places where people feel free or have been free for a very long time. And so it seems even more extraordinary that people can find these kind of interstitial, in-between places of feeling like kind of an openness. And I think it also kind of often connects with people feeling like, I don't need to spend money. I don't need to be productive. I can just kind of be. And I think that piece started to really help me think a lot about, well, what does it mean to really feel like sense of freedom in your own personhood? And how extraordinary that some of these places in not being kind of programmed allowed that sense for a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for, I'm in the museum world. I work for, the Exploratorium, and we're always wondering who comes and who feels comfortable there, and you begin to understand that not everyone feels welcome in certain places, depending upon their cultural background or the way they see their own identity. So I really loved thinking about that in your book, this, where a person does feel kind of like they disappear, like they're just there and they feel comfortable. And I thought that was a really nice concept to think about. That's what we need in cities, is places where people can feel like they dissolve.
Yeah.
They dissolve in the fabric of life, and nobody questions that they're there or not.
And I think that's a huge piece of a lot of the people that I talked with, I often thought, in the ways that these neighborhoods have changed, would you feel free to sort of just be taking a walk, just to be doing nothing, just to be hanging out? Is hanging out always okay? And so I think that's very frequently, as we kind of shape and constrain our cities more and more, that sort of capacity to just sort of be gets a little bit lost. And I think that's where, in thinking about kind of the psychology of all of this, it starts to I think it's so powerful to think about it in terms of like, what does that mean for people's own sense of self, right? Not only their sense of like, oh, I'm part of this city, or I'm part of this community, or I'm part of this, but what does it mean about the way that they think about themselves and kind of who they are, and how does that make them feel? How does that make you feel good? How does that make you feel like you're capable of thriving, right? And I think that capacity seems very important to what many of these places have the capacity to do.
Yeah. And I think we only have a few more minutes, but I wanted to have you talk a minute about it. The buzzword lately is place making in the design and the landscape architecture world. Is how do you create places where people want to be, and what to you, what's the difference between placemaking and place work?
Yeah, and just to add in another word, there's this notion of placekeeping. And I know, and I think that idea of, not sure that they're always in opposition to each other, but I think part of what I'm interested in from this kind of like place work notion is once a place either is made or exists or whatever it is, but that we think about places not as sort of only existing in the world, but we recognize the work that they do to kind of build the capacity for like a functional society, which I would say we're kind of like teetering at the moment. So what is it where places do this work that allows us to kind of do the undergirding that like basically allows kind of us to be able to see each other. And so I think there are ways in which, sort of kind of placemaking, it can be
chairs.
It can be chairs in public, can be benches. Let's make benches.
Chairs and trees.
Yeah, chairs and trees. I mean, and you can love chairs and trees. But I think it's sort of sometimes misses that, like, what is it that would allow those things to do this really important work of like that sense of people feeling like they can become themselves. What is that? Or even that sense of people being able to practice and negotiate. What is it to talk with someone who is a stranger, right? What is it that, how can those spaces do that work? Because that's not easy to do, and yet it is very necessary work. And so what is it that we can kind of help to make those things, make that more possible? And very often I think it has a lot to do with, not always, but a lot to do with the people who facilitate those places. So I think sometimes some of the focus on the physical, while being very important, because obviously we exist in a physical world, and design certainly is important, but I think it's like, well, what does it look like to say, how do we see that in relationship and in conversation with the people who make you feel like you're welcome there? What are the people who kind of help facilitate kind of a conversation between people who don't know each other? And sometimes it doesn't have to be an important conversation. Like, it really can be about nothing. So what is it that allows that? Because that is kind of this unlocking key toward a lot of bigger possibilities. And I think that's the piece that I often find sort of missing in a placemaking kind of narrative. And I would also say a huge part of all of this is really looking at and understanding the histories and the political histories and the current politics of all of our places. And so that without that, if you kind of keep it at the level of it's a nice bench to sit on and have lunch, you don't grapple with we need to grapple with how our cities have been shaped, and many of those are extremely the not just racist policies, but the discriminatory pieces of the histories of our cities. And they exist in very specific kinds of ways. And without really taking that apart, you kind of risk only playing at the edges. And I think that's a big part of like, well, how does it look to actually value the lived experience of an individual and see it as deeply connected to both social and historical context. But that's amazing.
So I think we're open to questions, right? This is the question and answer part of the night. Does anyone have a thought or a question? I mean, many of you know Gabrielle and saw her during her work, so maybe you have some thoughts about the way you thought about where you live, because
Well, I have a comment. My daughter's going to school at UC Irvine, and I don't know Irvine very well, but I was appalled when I first went. I mean, all of the roads are 8-lane roads. There are no people walking on the sidewalks, and all of the commercial spaces are in malls. So you definitely have a sense that there's a lot to be said for the physical plant. I mean, what the hell were they thinking when they built that city? Nobody was thinking.
It is famous. It is famously.
It's like, it's just appalling. And so, of course, you have to go to the surrounding towns to get that sense of place and sense of interaction. And I just completely dumbfounded me. But it really throws this into relief. Pardon?
Did it jar her at all?
Well,
from where you lived in Oakland, right?
Yeah. Well, my daughter grew up on 16th and Guerrero. She'd gone by the time I moved to Oakland. She lived in Boston, and then she lived in Manhattan, in Brooklyn, for 12 years and worked in the schools there. She couldn't wait to get back to California. But all of those cities are old cities.
Yeah.
With a lot of architecture that's a lot more intimate.
And you describe someone in the book that loves going to the library and just feeling like it makes her feel important because there's this amazing place that has the names of, historians or something on it, and yeah, architecture helps.
And I have to say that certainly post-COVID, I guess I've been more aware of and a huge appreciation for those inconsequential interactions in public spaces where you have a comment or a conversation or you help somebody to do something. And I remember almost being surprised at that almost physical welling of warmth from these interactions with people I'll never, ever see again. But they're places in my neighborhood. So.
And there's a way in which where you were was kind of making that thing possible, right?
Yeah, standing in line in the grocery store. Oh, your strap is twisted. Oh, yeah, I'll fix it for you. Whatever. I can help you pick that up, and then 20-minute conversation about our exercise program. Whatever. It's just. So yeah, definitely been much more conscious of that post-pandemic when we were deprived of those public spaces.
I just wanted to continue of what you said, because the reality is there will not be a recognition of the work small businesses do, period. When small businesses keep disappearing, this neighborhood here seems to be an exception, but but we do need this for our health, this banter and this, occasional dialogue. So what do we replace it with? And I think what you just said, this intentionality of this small tidbits of interaction wherever we can get it, that's one way to do it. And I'm just curious what other ways people are thinking is, how do you replace this? This kind of fabric of cities, it's not going to come back near future because we just live in a different world, and most people order online, including myself. I mean, when have I last been to a bookstore, really? It's appalling. That's the fact. So I think this intentional casual interactions with strangers are one way, and I'm just curious what else comes to mind for other people here.
I bring this example up all the time, but during COVID, a small business opened in my neighborhood. I live in Oakland, in what's called the Bella Vista area, and there are very few restaurants there. There's no place to go, and someone in the middle of COVID, or actually at the beginning, opened a cafe in what was a small corner store that had been abandoned for a long time, and they built this cafe around dogs. I don't own a dog, but people would come to this cafe because you could bring your dogs. And it was COVID, so we couldn't be inside, and the cafe had this amazing backyard garden, and then people also just migrated to the sidewalk and the street, and it's this incredible meeting place for hundreds of people in the neighborhood, and people I know that live in the neighborhood just a block or two away report that they've lived in the neighborhood 27 years, and until the cafe came, they've met more people in the months or years that the cafe has been open than in the 27 years that they've lived there. And it's the word organic comes to mind to me, because this place actually was designed by an architect. So it's really nice. So it's a symbol of gentrification in the neighborhood, but also homeless people go there, street people who are sort of vagrants come there and hang out. Everyone is accepted. People bring produce and put boxes of it out at the street. It's just this amazing thing, but there was something organic about it that it just, I don't know, it just sort of built on itself. And people spend hours there, and people come and go, and people come from out of town when they're in town visiting family, and they hang out. I don't know, it's just a really amazing phenomenon.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it does seem like after COVID, neighborhoods kind of came alive or something. Like it felt like downtown died.
Exactly.
But these things like that happened all around that kind of helped support people, and it's kind of an interesting phenomenon. And I feel like San Francisco has discovered its neighborhoods lately in a way that before maybe they hadn't quite, or something. New restaurants, places like you're describing, more out in the avenues in different places. But anyway, Janet, you were going to say something.
Well, a couple different things. I'm not ready to just assume it's all over. And I have talked a lot to Gabrielle about how do we work to support the creation of these spaces through taxes, through incentives, through infrastructure in our government that acknowledges the value. Because if we assume that that small business is a one-way trip to the dump, it will be. And we have, I think, acknowledged now that the impulse to buy online is as addictive as anything we've ever experienced as a culture. And I always knew the result of that would be the atrophying of the urban experience. So I would say that we've talked about the importance of this book to get the concept out, and I'm already running with, well, now what? Now that we all know this already, and it's good to have it, articulated concretely, but the next book should be like, okay, now what are we going to do? Yeah,
Well,
solve
I
the
mean,
problem.
although I would say I don't know that we all know this already. I mean, I think maybe like when you hear it, it feels right.
Yeah,
But I think it's not something that's always really acknowledged as something that requires protection in that way.
Well, in
It
the
sort of
same
feels
way,
like, well, it's part of the air. It's just nice to have. Oh, that's great. That's lovely. And it doesn't feel like this is an existential threat if you don't have it.
right.
And I think that's the switch that's important, and because that's the switch that you need to then say, you need to change policy.
Yeah,
You
we have to
cannot
change
have
policy, and
small
I want to
businesses
go
have
to
no
the idea
protection.
of cell phones in schools and the way in which they just sort of morphed into the classroom, and everybody's like, oh, it's kind of like insipid thing is happening, and oh my God, now it's a tragedy that has happened, and our students are completely distracted. And now there's this sort of trying to get a hold of it and to, through policy, alter our behavioral experience of technology. So can we use that same larger picture to alter as a community our experience of where we shop? And then maybe take the headphones out? You know,
Yeah.
like how many times, I mean, I'm a chatter. How many times have I talked to somebody who doesn't even know that I'm there because they're listening to probably a fabulous podcast as they walk by me, right? Because they don't see any value in talking to me, right? They have curated their own experience with their own music and even their own visuals on their phone, and they're not even aware where they are, right?
Well, I mean, and I think that's part of, I don't think it's like, well, there's no hope. But I do think it's important for us to like recognize how many of the choices that either we personally make or that we politically have made, that they narrow our ways of being with other
Our
people.
economic.
And
Political, it's not so
and
much the
become-
political as it is the economic choices we've made.
Well, both.
And
I
then
think,
it becomes
I think
political.
that we make choices about how, to that point of so carefully curating our experiences so that they never involve something unexpected or potentially that we disagree with, right? And if we don't ever, I think one of the things that seems so important about some of these places is that the ones that do really important work are where people can practice negotiating with people who they disagree with, or who might be different from them, or who might be strangers, right? And where, and you have to practice doing that at a low stakes level before you can do it at a high stakes level. And I feel like there's a way in which we are very out of practice of doing that. And you can't start at when it really matters. You have to start where it kind of doesn't matter to be able to practice that thing. And I think that's part of in thinking about what's so important about these spaces is what does it look like when you can do that kind of on a regular, very low stakes sort of way. And that does look like, being participating in the world, but B, kind of being able to have kind of this unexpected, but there are places in which that can happen. It can't just happen. You don't just scream at somebody on the street. I mean, if you do, then that's not going to work out very well, right? So these kinds of things need to have a space to happen in, right? You don't have a tennis match in the middle of the road, right? You have it on a tennis court. You can't have a space for conversation and dialogue just anywhere. They need something that holds them, and I think that's part of what we can see some of these small spaces doing, but we have to kind of think about how do we value that. And I think that's the shift, and I think there are real policy things which aren't rocket science, right, between vacancy decontrol, or what does it look like to say small businesses have rental protections, or none of those things are rocket science. They're pretty simple, but if we don't say why that matters, then zero people will ever vote for those things or advocate for them, right? And so there are baseline things that we need to be able to have happen so that there can be long-term kind of protection for the places that do this work. I do think that we might be, are we out of time?
One more
question?
I think one more question, if there's any comment or thought anybody has.
Yeah.
I have one if you don't mind.
Yes.
What did the some of the people that you talked to in the making of this book, did they get to see it? Were they excited about it? Did they have anything to add? What was their reaction? All therein.
Oh, sure. Yes, they all have seen it and have it and know about it. And they're like, oh my God, that's from so long ago. Why have you held on to this? It's clearly insane. But I think also it was very emotional for a lot of people. And because I think, there is loss as a big part of this book for sure. I mean, there's loss, in over a period of time, there is loss. And so personal loss, not just loss of place, but personal losses, but also nostalgia for place, and also a lot of people. So David with the playground, he's clearly not a teenager anymore, and in talking with him, he was like, it's so emotional to have that moment in my life when nobody was asking me how I felt about anything, to kind of be recorded. And to be able to look back at that, and he has kids now, and so to be able to kind of hold on to that, I think was quite important. But a lot of people, it wasn't all the past is gone. A lot of people were like, well, wait, I think we could reconnect with that person, or what if we told this story to this person, and maybe even if they're not around anymore, we could reach. I know another person who knows them. So it has also kind of opened up ways of making connections. That has been exciting. The bike store that showed you guys a picture of three men in a bike store in Preston Heights, and so two of them have passed away, but the guy who now runs the bike store, I went in, I called him up and I said, you're not going to remember this, but 20 years ago I came in with Neville, and he was taking me on a tour of the neighborhood, and we were talking about bikes. He was like, oh yeah, of course I remember you. I was like, why? And he's like, oh yeah, and you were taking the pictures and everything. And so it's been this, and that place is still there and going really strong, and it is kind of this really beautiful example of a lot of the work that talked about in the book, of that kind of longevity, and as a family-owned business, of doing this work through the bike repair store, but doing this kind of possibilities for longevity and that connection. So yeah, it was very emotional for me in all of those connections as well.
I mean, I also have to say your book is really beautifully written.
Thank you.
So it really draws you in, regardless of the subject. So.
Just get them in,
Yeah, it's just
People
really
like to be heard,
Yes.
and that's what your book does. It gives voice to
Yeah.
the many
Yeah, she
who
writes
make the cities what they are.
Thank you all
So
for
thank
coming.
Thank you for writing it.
Thank you so kindly. Can we get one more hand for Gabrielle and Susan?
Yeah.
Thank you both so much. This was, I think a lot about place, and I spend a lot of time in this place in particular, and so this book is important to me as a bookseller and as a person thinking about connection and neighborhoods and what we can do with the places that
That's great.
So thank you so kindly. I will be brief. I'm so appreciative of you all for being here. We have copies of The Cities We Meet at the front register. If you haven't taken a look at it yet, please do. It is up there. I'm assuming you would be happy to sign copies for people. She's gonna sign, folks. If you have any questions, do let me know. And if not, we will see you next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.